It was around the time of my first doorbell camera alert when I first started noticing something was off, and it only got worse from there. My name is Gavin Holloway. I had just moved into a townhouse on the quiet side of a sprawling suburb. It was a corner unit with a small front porch, a side gate, and a narrow backyard. Because I worked odd hours and had a lot of packages delivered, I installed a basic doorbell camera. I mounted it right next to the front door, angled outward to capture the steps in the walkway. The way my porch was built, a thick brick pillar on the left side held up the roof over the door. Because of where the camera was mounted, that pillar created a solid blind spot. The camera could see the driveway and street perfectly, but it couldn't see the 2 feet of space immediately to the left of my door. As long as it recorded anyone walking up the steps, I didn't care. The first few weeks were completely normal. Every time the motion sensor tripped, my phone sent a short notification and saved a 12-second clip. Usually, it was just the mail carrier dropping off a box, or the neighborhood stray cat wandering across the driveway. About a month after I moved in, things changed. I was lying in bed trying to get to sleep and my phone vibrated on the nightstand. It was 2:30 a.m. I picked it up and saw a motion alert from the front door. I opened the app expecting a raccoon or a stray cat. When the video loaded, the porch was empty. There were no cars driving by and no animals on the walkway. The motion sensor was pretty sensitive, but there was absolutely nothing moving on the screen. I watched the 12-second clip from the beginning. For the first 10 seconds, absolutely nothing happened. But right at the very end of the clip, I noticed something down in the bottom left corner of the frame. It was right on the edge of the blind spot behind the brick pillar. It was the front half of a shoe. Someone was standing behind the pillar, just inches out of the camera's full view. Only the tip of their dark sneaker was visible on the concrete. The shoe didn't move. Whoever was standing there was perfectly still, waiting right outside my front door. I felt uneasy. I went downstairs trying to keep my footsteps quiet and pressed my eye against the peephole. Nothing. Just the empty walkway illuminated by the distant street lamp. I stood there in the dark entryway for a few minutes just listening. I didn't hear anything outside. I convinced myself that it was probably just a neighbor who had been out for a late walk and stopped to check their phone before moving on. I locked the deadbolt, went back upstairs, and eventually fell asleep. I forgot about the shoe until Friday night. I was up late watching a movie in the living room. All the lights in the house were off except for the television. Around 1:15 a.m., my phone lit up on the coffee table. Another motion alert from the front door. I paused the movie and opened the app. My stomach dropped when the video loaded. Down in the bottom left corner in the exact same spot was the shoe. But this time, it wasn't just the shoe. I could see a sliver of a dark jacket sleeve resting against the edge of the brick pillar. The person was leaning against the wall, pressing themselves into the corner right next to my door. The 12-second clip played out. The person did not move a single inch. They were just standing there motionless, entirely concealed within the blind spot except for that tiny fraction of their arm and foot. I sat frozen on the couch. The living room was completely silent. The front door was only about 20 feet away from where I was sitting. I muted the television, straining to hear anything from outside. There was a soft scraping noise. It sounded like someone shifting their weight on the concrete porch. I slowly stood up and crept toward the door. I made my way to the peephole and looked out. Again, the center of the porch was empty. I grabbed the handle of the door, thinking about throwing it open and yelling at whoever was out there to leave. But I stopped myself. Something felt off. The way they were standing so perfectly still didn't seem like a harmless loiterer. It seemed deliberate. I stepped back from the door and checked the live feed on my phone. The sleeve and the shoe were gone. The person had silently walked away while I was looking through the peephole. Over the next 2 weeks, it happened 3 more times. Always between midnight and 3 a.m. Always the exact same setup. My phone would buzz. I would open the clip, and I would see just a tiny fragment of a person standing behind the brick pillar. Sometimes it was the edge of a shoulder. Once, it was a gloved hand resting flat against the brick. That was when the reality of the situation actually hit me. This person wasn't just standing out of view by coincidence. They knew exactly where the camera was pointing. They had figured out the exact line where the camera's vision ended, and they were intentionally standing right on the other side of it. They were just standing there, inches from my door, listening. The thought of opening my front door in the middle of the night, only to find someone pressed flat against the wall waiting for me, made me sick to my stomach. I ordered a new camera system online. The package came with a few extra cameras, so I set one up inside my kitchen window, pointing directly at the back patio, and planned to mount the rest over the weekend. It was a Thursday night. I had driven out to a friend's place and ended up staying later than I intended. By the time I got in my car to drive back to the townhouse, it was almost 11:45 p.m. I was about a mile away from my neighborhood when my phone chimed in the cup holder. I glanced down at the screen. It was a motion alert from the front door. I didn't open it right away because I was driving, but a deep sense of unease settled over me. I knew exactly what was on that clip. The person was back. 30 seconds later, my phone chimed again. This was strange. The camera shouldn't trigger again that quickly unless someone had walked entirely out of frame and then walked back in. I reached a red light and picked up my phone. The first notification was from the front door. The second notification was from the new camera I had temporarily mounted inside my kitchen window. Then, as I was looking at the screen, a third notification popped up. Motion detected at the side gate. Someone was circling my house. I pressed the gas pedal hard when the light turned green. I didn't want to watch the clips while I was driving. I just wanted to get home. My heart was pounding against my ribs as I turned into my subdivision. The streets were dark and quiet. I pulled into my driveway and put the car in park. I left the headlights on, shining directly onto the front porch. The porch was empty. There was no one behind the brick pillar. The yard was clear. I got out of the car, clutched my keys, and walked quickly up the walkway, constantly looking over my shoulder. I reached the front door, unlocked it as fast as I could, stepped inside and slammed the heavy door shut. I locked the deadbolt. I let out a long breath. I was safe inside. The house was completely dark and quiet. I walked into the living room, tossing my keys onto the counter. I sat down on the edge of the couch and pulled my phone out of my pocket. My hands were shaking a little bit as I opened the security app. I needed to see what had triggered all 3 cameras in less than 2 minutes. I started with the most recent clip, the one from the front door, to see if they had left. The video loaded. The porch was dark. Down in the bottom left corner, the familiar dark jacket sleeve was visible against the brick pillar. But this time, the person didn't stay still. About 5 seconds into the 12-second clip, a tall shadow stepped completely out from behind the pillar. The person was wearing a dark hooded sweatshirt pulled tight around their face. They walked quickly across the porch and down the steps, moving out of the camera's view toward the side of my house. I paused the video. My eyes locked onto the timestamp in the corner of the screen. 11:58 p.m. I looked at the clock on my phone. It was 11:59 p.m. The shadow hadn't left minutes ago. They stepped off the porch only seconds before my headlights swept across the driveway. They were standing there right as I pulled up. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly very dry. I went back to the app and loaded the clip from the side gate, the one that had recorded right before the front door clip. The video started. The gate swung open. The hooded figure didn't walk out of my backyard. They walked in. They didn't leave the property when I pulled up. They just moved to the back. I sat completely still in the quiet living room. I didn't breathe. From the kitchen, just a few feet away, I heard a slow, deliberate sliding sound. It was the heavy sound of my glass patio door being eased open along its metal track. Would you have gone inside, or would you have stayed in your car? At first, I thought it was just my imagination while I was at the gym, until it happened again. My name is William Calder. I work long hours at a logistics company, so by the time I get off work, eat dinner, and finally settle down, it is usually late. To avoid the massive crowds, I signed up for a basic membership at a 24-hour gym about 10 minutes from my apartment. I almost always went after 10 p.m. At that time of night, the place was practically a ghost town. There was usually only a tired employee sitting at the front desk, and maybe 2 or 3 other people scattered across the massive weight room floor. I liked the quiet. It gave me time to focus and unwind without having to wait for equipment or deal with crowded spaces. The men's locker room was located in the very back of the building, past the basketball courts and the group fitness rooms. It was a long, narrow room with rows of tall gray metal lockers on either side and a few heavy wooden benches bolted to the floor in the center. I always used the same locker, number 42, right in the middle of the third row. It was out of habit more than anything else. I brought my own combination lock from home. It was one of those standard silver dial locks. I would put my work clothes, my keys, and my wallet inside, snap the heavy metal latch shut, and head out to the floor with just my headphones and my phone. Everything was completely normal for the first few months. Then, on a Tuesday night in early October, something felt off. I had arrived around 10:30 p.m., finished my usual routine, and headed back to the locker room a little before midnight. The room was totally empty. The bright overhead fluorescent lights buzzed quietly above me. I walked down the third aisle to locker 42. When I got there, I stopped. The metal door was resting slightly ajar. My stomach dropped. I immediately reached out and pulled the door open. My first thought was that my wallet and car keys were gone. But when I looked inside, everything was sitting exactly where I had left it. My gray gym bag was on the bottom, my jeans were hung on the hook, and my wallet was tucked securely inside my left shoe. I looked at the silver combination lock. It was hanging from the metal loop, completely open. The shackle was pulled all the way up. I felt a quick rush of anxiety, but I tried to rationalize it. Sometimes, if you don't push the metal shackle down hard enough into the base, it doesn't actually click into place. I figured I must have just been careless when I locked it earlier. I had spun the dial, assuming it was secured, and walked away. No one had been in there, and nothing was missing, so I just grabbed my things, changed, and went home. I didn't think much of it until the following Monday. I got to the gym at 10:15 p.m. I walked into the locker room, went straight to locker 42, and put my things away. This time, I made absolutely sure the lock was secure. I pushed down hard on the metal shackle, gave it a firm tug to make sure it wouldn't pop open, and then spun the dial several times. It was locked tight. I went out to the weight room. There were only 2 other people there. One was a guy on a stationary bike near the front windows. The other was a man using the cable machines a few aisles over from me. I started my workout. About 20 minutes in, I noticed the man from the cable machines had moved to a seated chest press machine directly across from where I was lifting. I only noticed him because he wasn't actually doing anything. He was just sitting there, resting his hands on his knees, staring straight ahead. He didn't look like he was exercising. He wasn't sweating, and he was wearing dark jeans and a thick gray hoodie, which seemed strange for a gym. I tried to ignore him and focus on my music. I finished my sets and moved over to the free weight section. A few minutes later, I realized the man in the gray hoodie had moved again. He was now standing near the dumbbell rack, holding a lightweight dumbbell, but he wasn't lifting it. He was just looking at his phone, but his body was angled perfectly toward me. I felt uneasy. I decided to cut my workout short. I put my weights back and walked quickly down the long hallway toward the locker room. The locker room was empty. I walked down the third row to locker 42. I reached for the lock. It was locked tight. The dial was secure. I let out a slow breath. I spun the dial, entered my combination, and popped the lock open. But as soon as I swung the metal door open, I froze. The inside of my locker was wrong. It wasn't a total mess, but small things had been moved. When I put my things away, I always placed my spare water bottle on the left side of the top shelf, right next to my rolled-up white gym towel. Now, the water bottle was on the far right side of the shelf, and the towel was different. I always rolled it up into a tight cylinder. Now, it was unfolded and draped neatly over my gym bag on the bottom floor of the locker. I stood there staring at it. I hadn't moved those things. I knew exactly how I left my locker. Someone had been inside, but the lock had been completely secure when I walked up. That meant whoever did this knew my exact combination. I grabbed my things, shoving everything into my bag as fast as I could. I left the gym without showering. When I got home, I immediately threw the old dial lock in the trash. The next day, I went to a hardware store and bought a brand new padlock. This one was a heavy-duty lock with a 4-digit rolling combination. I set the new code to a random string of numbers I had never used for anything else. I told myself it was just a prank. Maybe someone watched me put my code in from down the aisle. The new lock would fix the problem. On Thursday night, I went back. I arrived at 10:45 p.m. I went straight to locker 42, put my stuff inside, and locked the new padlock. I scrambled the numbers and pulled hard on the metal. It was perfectly secure. I walked out to the floor. The gym was quiet. I got on a treadmill near the back wall. About 10 minutes into my run, I caught movement in the mirrored wall in front of me. The man in the gray hoodie was back. He stepped onto a treadmill in the row directly behind mine. He didn't turn the machine on. He just stood on the black rubber belt looking down at his phone. I watched him in the mirror. He never looked up, but he never started walking either. My heart started beating faster. I hit the stop button on my treadmill. I wiped my forehead, stepped down, and walked purposefully toward the locker room. I didn't look back at him. I just wanted to get my things and leave. I pushed through the heavy wooden door into the locker room. The faint smell of chlorine from the nearby pool mixed with the harsh scent of cleaning supplies. The room was absolutely silent. I walked down the third row. Locker 42 was right in front of me. The heavy-duty lock was still there. It was completely closed. I felt a small wave of relief. The new lock had worked. I rolled the 4 metal dials to my new combination. I pulled the lock down and slipped it off the latch. I opened the metal door. My gym bag was at the bottom. My clothes were hanging on the hook. My rolled-up towel was on the top shelf, right next to the water bottle. Everything was exactly where I left it, except for one thing. Sitting directly in the center of the top shelf, resting on the bare metal, was a small, torn piece of lined paper. I stared at it. I hadn't put any paper in my locker. I slowly reached out and picked it up. There was handwriting on it in dark blue ink. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a step. 10:45 p.m., it was the exact time I had walked through the front doors of the gym that night. My hands started to shake. The new lock hadn't stopped him. He had gotten inside again. He hadn't taken my wallet or my keys. He just left this piece of paper to prove that he could, to prove that he was watching me. Then, from the front of the locker room, I heard the heavy squeal of hinges. The main wooden door swung open and shut. I stopped breathing. I stood completely still in the middle of the third aisle, clutching the small piece of paper. I waited to hear the squeak of sneakers on the tile floor. I waited to hear the rustle of a gym bag being set down. I waited for someone to walk past the end of my row. There was nothing. Just total silence. Whoever had just walked into the locker room wasn't moving. They were standing perfectly still right by the entrance, just around the corner from my aisle. I didn't wait to see who it was. I grabbed my bag, left the locker door wide open, and sprinted down the opposite end of the aisle toward the rear emergency exit. I pushed the heavy metal bar, setting off a loud blaring alarm, and ran out into the cold night air. I never went back to that gym. I canceled my membership over the phone the next morning. I still don't know who the man in the hoodie was or what he wanted with me. But the thing that bothers me the most wasn't the piece of paper. It was the realization that the only way he could have opened my new lock was if he had been standing close enough to watch me set the dials. Had you ever had the feeling that someone was standing right behind you? When I first arrived at the gas station that morning, I didn't think anything of it, but looking back, that was my first mistake. My name is Raymond Alves. I work at a large data processing center located on the outskirts of the city. Because my company handles international accounts, my shifts are incredibly strict. I have to be logged into my computer and at my desk by exactly 6:30 a.m. every single weekday. To make sure I am never late, I follow the exact same routine. I wake up, get dressed, and leave my apartment at 5:45. On my drive to work, I take the exact same route. And every single morning, I stop at the exact same gas station on the corner of Elm and 4th Street to buy a large black coffee. It is a very boring, very set routine. I know the overnight cashiers by face. I know exactly which parking spot is closest to the sliding glass doors, and I know exactly how many minutes the entire stop will take. The gas station itself is fairly large. It has 8 pumps in the front, a brightly lit convenience store, and a sprawling, dark parking lot that extends toward a row of commercial dumpsters in the back. Usually, at that time of the morning, the place is completely empty. It was a Tuesday in late November when the routine finally broke. The mornings were getting much colder, and the sun wasn't coming up until well after 7. I pulled my car into the lot a few minutes before 6 a.m. The main pump area under the bright canopy was completely clear, which was totally normal. I parked in my usual spot right by the front doors, turned off the engine, and walked inside to pour my coffee. I paid the cashier, walked back out, and took a sip from the paper cup. As I was walking toward my driver's side door, I casually glanced out toward the far side of the parking lot, over by the air pump and the large dumpsters. Resting in the darkest part of the lot, there was a silver sedan. It was parked facing the street. The headlights were off, but I could clearly see a thick cloud of exhaust pluming from the tailpipe into the freezing morning air. The engine was running. It was an older model, maybe from the early 2000s. From where I was standing, I could see a very distinct, deep dent right on the corner of the rear passenger side bumper. I really didn't think much of it. Gas stations are public places. I just figured it belonged to the overnight cashier, or maybe someone had pulled over to take a quick nap before starting a long drive. I got into my car, turned on the heater, and drove the rest of the way to the data center without giving the silver car a second thought. The next morning was Wednesday. I left my apartment at my normal time, drove my normal route, and pulled into the gas station. I parked, walked inside, paid for my coffee, and walked back out to the cold air. Before I got into my car, I looked over toward the dumpsters. The silver sedan was sitting in the exact same spot. It was idling again, the exhaust slowly rising into the dark sky. The headlights were still completely off. I felt a little curious, but not scared. I still assumed it was just an employee's car that had been left running to warm up. But on Thursday, my routine changed. I had forgotten my security badge on my kitchen counter and had to turn around halfway to work. Because of the delay, I didn't get to the gas station until almost 6:15 a.m. The sky was just starting to lighten up a little bit. The parking lot was slightly busier, with a delivery truck parked near the side of the building. But when I walked out of the store with my coffee, I immediately noticed the silver sedan. It was still parked by the dumpsters, but something had changed. It wasn't facing the street anymore. Whoever was driving had backed the car into the space. Now, the front of the sedan was pointed directly at the front doors of the gas station. It was pointed directly at me. I couldn't see through the windshield because of the heavy glare from the overhead street lamps, but I knew for a fact someone was sitting inside because the engine was running. I walked a little faster to my car and locked the doors as soon as I sat down. As I drove out of the lot and turned onto the main road, I looked in my rearview mirror. The sedan did not move. That night, things went from slightly weird to deeply unsettling. I got home from work around 5 p.m., ate dinner, and spent a few hours watching television in my living room. My apartment is located on the second floor of an older, brick building in a quiet residential neighborhood. My living room has 2 large windows that look directly out over the street in front of the building. Most of the residents park on the street, so it is usually lined with cars. Around 10:30 p.m., I went to the kitchen to get a glass of water. On my way back to the bedroom, I paused to look out the living room window down at the street below. My stomach dropped. Parked on the exact opposite side of the street, tucked deeply into the heavy shadow between 2 tall oak trees, was a car. Even in the dim yellow lighting of the neighborhood street lamps, I could tell it was an older silver sedan. I reached out and quickly turned off the living room lamp so I could get a better look without being easily seen from the outside. I stood slightly to the side of the window frame and stared down at the dark street. The car was idling. There was a thin stream of exhaust, slowly drifting out from the back. I strained my eyes, focusing as hard as I could on the rear passenger side bumper. There was a deep, distinct dent right on the corner of the metal. It was the exact same car from the gas station. It was parked directly across from my building, and the front end of the vehicle was pointed right at the main entrance downstairs. I felt uneasy. I stood there in the dark, trying to rationalize what I was looking at. I tried to tell myself it was a massive coincidence. Maybe the person lived in my neighborhood and just happened to work near the gas station. I watched the silver car for almost 20 minutes. It never moved a single inch. The doors never opened. Nobody got out. Eventually, I closed the blinds, made sure my front door deadbolt was locked, and went to bed. I didn't sleep well at all that night. I kept listening for the sound of an engine in the street. The next morning was Friday. I woke up feeling exhausted and incredibly anxious. I debated skipping the gas station entirely and just getting coffee at the office. but I convinced myself I was overreacting. I needed to know if the car was still there. I needed to see if the pattern was real. I arrived at the gas station right at 5:45. The lot was dark and completely empty. I parked near the front doors. I kept my hands firmly on the steering wheel and looked over toward the large commercial dumpsters. The parking spot was empty. There was no silver sedan. I let out a slow, deep breath. I actually felt completely relieved. I went inside the store, poured my coffee, and smiled at the cashier as I paid. I felt entirely foolish for being so paranoid the night before. It really was just a coincidence. I walked out of the sliding glass doors, taking my car keys out of my jacket pocket. I took a few steps toward my driver's side door. Then, I heard the heavy sound of an engine idling. I stopped walking and looked up. The silver sedan wasn't parked far away by the dumpsters. It was parked at the very last gas pump, only about 30 feet away from where I was standing. The engine was running quietly. The headlights were turned off, but the interior dome light inside the car was switched on. Sitting in the driver's seat was a man. He was wearing a dark winter jacket and a dark baseball cap pulled extremely low over his forehead. Because the dome light was illuminating the entire inside of the car, I could see his face perfectly. He wasn't looking down at his phone. He wasn't looking at the gas pump screen. He had his head turned completely to the side, and he was staring directly at me through the closed driver's side window. Something felt off. It wasn't a casual glance from a stranger. It was a fixed, intense stare. He didn't blink, and he didn't break eye contact, even when I stopped walking and stared back. We just looked at each other in the freezing morning air for a few long seconds. Then, without taking his eyes off me, he reached up with his right hand and slowly turned off the dome light, plunging the inside of the car into total darkness. I didn't wait around to see what he was going to do next. I practically sprinted to my car, got inside, and slammed the door. I locked it immediately. I threw the car in reverse, backed up as fast as I could, and sped out of the parking lot onto the main road. I kept frantically checking my rearview mirror, expecting to see his headlights suddenly turn on and follow me down the street. But he stayed parked perfectly still at the pump. I drove to work, but I couldn't focus on anything all day. I kept thinking about the way he was looking at me. He knew my morning routine perfectly. He knew exactly where I lived. He knew exactly what time I would walk out of those sliding gas station doors. I ended up leaving work 2 hours early that afternoon. I wanted to get home while it was still bright out. I decided not to park on the street in front of my building where anyone could easily see my car. Instead, I drove around the block to park in the narrow alleyway directly behind my apartment complex. It is a very tight, gravel alleyway that only the residents use, and it leads directly to the heavy metal back stairwell of my building. I pulled my car in, turned off the engine, and put it in park. I grabbed my work bag from the passenger seat and stepped out onto the gravel. That was when I noticed them. Right next to the back stairwell, leading directly up to the rear door of my building, were thick, fresh tire tracks pressed deep into the loose dirt and gravel. They were completely fresh, and based on how the tracks were overlapping, they belonged to a car that had pulled in, sat idling long enough to melt the light layer of morning frost on the ground, and then slowly backed out. Nobody parked back there except for me. The other residents didn't even use the rear entrance. I stood perfectly still in the cold alleyway, staring down at the ground, realizing that he hadn't just been watching my front door the night before. He had been looking for a way inside. If you saw a strange car waiting outside your house, would you call the police immediately or wait to see what they did?